Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Nicole Lamberson. I trained as a physician assistant and I volunteer doing outreach for the film Medicating Normal, and I host conversations like this one today. Our guest today is Anders Sørensen. He is a Danish clinical psychologist with a special interest in psychiatric drug withdrawal. He has undertaken research which assesses the state of guidance on psychiatric drug withdrawal. And he's also paid close attention to tapering methods with the aim of identifying approaches which might make withdrawal more tolerable for people. In addition to his research work, Anders utilizes psychotherapy in his private practice when helping people to come off the drugs. And we'll get to talk about some of that here in this interview today. So thank you so much, Anders, for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
Sure. And
Really?
Tell me before we start, Anders is the correct pronunciation,
Well,
right?
we don't pronounce the D in Danish, but in English,
Okay.
Yes, that is perfect.
Okay, great.
It's a silent D in Danish.
Yeah. Oh, so it's honors.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
That sounds weird in English. So
Okay. All right. Got it. So
yeah.
I guess we'll start out just by, I ask this question to anyone who comes on and who has an interest in, psychiatric medications and withdrawal and their potential for harm and risk. Like, what brought you to this type of work?
Yeah.
How did you even know it existed and become interested in the first place?
I didn't. That's kind of part of the story. It's a very specific interest to have, definitely, and a very niche research area too. So short story, because it is a long story, but the short story is that the more I learned about psychotherapy and what that is and what we do in psychotherapy, I kind of noticed that psychotherapy and medication, at least in the long term, have somewhat conflicting goals. There are two different solutions to a problem, especially over the long term, and in mainly three ways. First of all, basically, in therapy and in psychotherapy, we kind of need access to emotion. Mm-hmm. They are, depending on which therapeutic school you bought into, basically emotions are guides, and we need them, even when they hurt and even when it sucks, we need them. And our job as therapists, one of the jobs for us is to help navigate that. And that's very difficult to do while it's muted or numbed or medicated away in one form or another. So that's one of three ways that it can really be conflicting goals. So we need full access to emotion. There are guides in therapy. They can be our window into what's really wrong and how to solve it. Second, psychotherapy, and this is a big one, to me is really about, I take it literally, the psychotherapy. It's about regulating the mind via the mind. So we have all sorts of exercise as a way of talking about it, to finding that inner controllability of our racing thoughts, all our what ifs, all our why thoughts, all our traumas, if just thoughts, these endless ruminations and worries that can become so powerful that can keep a completely fatigued body awake, right? And they can keep us distant and they can keep us not present. So there's this idea that psychotherapy is about discovering that inner controllability. The question is, how do we use our mind to regulate our mind? And drugs can, in some way, inadvertently reinforce this experience that it's uncontrollable, and can do that while it has symptoms. So in some way, it's actually the exactly opposite of what we're trying to achieve in psychotherapy. And third, the medical model tends to not ask some of the relevant questions that we need to ask in psychotherapy. For example, what we're depressed or anxious or psychotic over, like this. What goes before that question is rarely asked if we've really bought into the idea that it's a disease. So a lot of doors are shut in the medical model. I hope that makes sense. So the point I'm trying to make is, and the research is clear on this, we know that there's a short-term benefit of the drug, but a long-term harm. It's not really that controversial of a statement. So I realized early on when I learned this and started doing therapy that at some point in therapy, the drug had to be withdrawn to proceed with these goals. Mm-hmm. And then I realized, as you know, that you can't just stop. Patients I had couldn't just stop. And I was fresh out of university at that time. We were taught the same thing as you know about them not be causing dependence and very brief and mild withdrawal symptoms and all this. That's in the guidelines. So what brought me to this was really this observation that my clients couldn't just stop when they wanted to and actually needed to. And they struggled far more than I had just been told and could see in the guidelines that it was supposed to. And you don't need to, read many pages of books about that to find out that that's really, really unfair, that people only find out how difficult it is to come off when they stand in the middle of it. So it was that very specific experience that sparked my interest in this.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense.
Really?
I guess, can you expand a little bit more on like the trouble you were having giving psychotherapy to your clients who were medicated?
Yeah.
You gave the 3 ways or whatever. I'm just thinking about myself. Like I was in therapy when I was heavily medicated on polypharmacy, and some of what you said, the numbing and that kind of thing. But also I wonder if you saw in any of your clients, I feel like the drugs for me, like manufactured fake emotions. Like I was having all kinds of drug induced stuff that I thought was the way that I really felt, but it was all fake. Did you encounter?
That's another really, like, it's just really a logical problem. Why you might be doing therapy on, what do we call them? Artificial emotions, because obviously they feel real. That's the whole problem. I'm not trying to not acknowledge that, but I think there's a lot of therapy going on that doesn't work because the emotions or the whole state you're in is one of the side effects or the effects of the drug, really. So you're absolutely right. My first answer to that question would really be, the problem is they numb the emotions we need. And that's really where biological psychiatry, at least, and clinical psychology diverge, really. Do we believe that these are signs of something that we should take seriously? Or do we believe they are reactions to a context, certain event, life story, trauma, whatever it is? Or do we believe they just occur out of no reason? Obviously, those are 2 very different ways of treating it. But the other problem, that's a good point you make here, because we might be doing therapy on not you.
Yeah.
Good luck with that. And I think that's why some of this treatment can be like perceived almost endlessly and appear to not work. Yeah.
Well, and did your clients, did they realize that they were impaired or numb or not able to access the real emotions, or was it you who understood that?
That's a good. What came first? I guess that's a shared experience when navigating and exploring their emotional life. Obviously, it's really, you only find out when you're off the drug. That's really why it became so crucial to because we can sit and talk about this for hours and we could analyze. And the only real, like the ultimate answer to that question lies after withdrawal. So we can that's our only way to get a clear window into how it looks. So that's one of the problems, really. And we know they can cause anxiety, for example, and depressed moods, especially the antipsychotics, like the overlap between what is considered side effects and what's considered symptoms of various diagnoses. It's huge. So that's one thing. We really need those emotions and thoughts. Otherwise, what usually happens is you do therapy while medicated, and then you kind of need to do a lot of it again once you're off the drug, because we didn't have access to that. Obviously, also finding the root problem is really difficult if the so-called symptoms are numbed. And now I should emphasize, when saying all this, I do genuinely understand the need to quiet and calm an uncontrollable mind. To do that, because it can get very, very noisy and messy in there, and it can completely overwhelm us. And so if you react in ways that you don't really understand why yet, if it feels incomprehensible in some way, and uncontrollable and overwhelming, I get why I would do the same. The medical solution in some way is appealing. So I'm not trying to discourage that. If the drug has that effect on you, that's the next problem, because psychiatric drugs affect people very differently. It helps some, for some it does absolutely nothing, and for a third party it actually does outright harm. So I just wanted to stress that and this is really how we're trying to, at least in my work, trying to get drugs categorized as a strategy, really, not as something you could have a physiological need for. We know that's not the case with the imbalances and so, but we're trying to phrase them as strategies, really, that can calm that, if they can do that.
Okay. Can you speak a little bit more to that when you say strategies? Are you talking sort of like the Joanna Moncrief type, drugs have an action, they calm you down, but they're not
Yes,
treating a chemical imbalance per
yeah,
se, or
that's her model. Yes, exactly. She was
yeah.
on one of my papers in my PhD on her drug-centered and disease-centered model, this idea. So this is not about no drugs. It's not about all drugs suck, they should be abandoned. It's about using them in a different way that automatically they would be used less and in way shorter periods of time. That's my game here, to try to change and actually this was how they were used back in the 50s and 60s. It's very interesting to read back. For example, say what we call an antipsychotic today was called a major tranquilizer back then. Now, if you call it a major tranquilizer now in the medical community, you sound like someone who hasn't been updated since the 50s. People would kind of correct you, saying, oh, that's not what we call them. That's an ancient term, but actually that's what we want to go back to. Here are some drugs that maybe can calm you, tranquilize you, maybe help you get focused. Can you use that for anything? And that changes the way we would use them dramatically.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. And it would make sense, like this uncontrollability, when we think about it, it's in every single diagnosis we've got. It's called transdiagnostic. The experience, like the feeling of not being in control, and that can manifest as depression, stress, anxiety, psychosis. These are just different phases of the same problem. So and when we're in that situation, we feel like we want to escape. And some of the people, like the most traumatized people or anxious people, say that they want to like escape their own bodies, escape their own minds. And drugs do, for some, provide a means to that. And if we could change the way we talk about these drugs and use them, not as anti-insert diagnosis, but as drugs, really. That's one of the end goals here, because and a whole lot of talk, like they can definitely work. They can reduce symptoms and make us feel better, while reinforcing this idea that it's uncontrollable. Nothing confirms uncontrollability more than you have to do or take something in order to get it under control. So these two different levels we're trying to emphasize. Okay.
So you say then that you had your psychotherapy clients and you realized that they couldn't just stop taking the medication, even though they wanted to. So then you get involved in this whole world of psychiatric drug tapering. I guess maybe could you tell us a little bit about your clinical philosophy for working with patients and psychiatric drug tapering then?
So my clinical philosophy of working, how I do it?
Yeah, basically like how you think about it and what is your process, I guess? So you have this client and they're at the point where they're ready to come off of the medication, and you've decided that psychotherapy would benefit them only if they come off the medication. So where do we go from there? How do you go about it?
First of all, I'll try to be I'll describe it empowering and sharing, educating in some way in the best sense. So I'm a guy who was, you're right, this threw me. I didn't expect that from being a clinical psychologist getting in. Most of my work is very geeky pharmacological work. I didn't see that coming. But I did all that, and I still do that in order to understand what withdrawal symptoms are, basically. So I realized that being able to manage being off the drug and being able to come off are two very, very different things. That was the problem we were facing. So I've spent a lot of time in my PhD before and after that to understand what this is, what withdrawal is, and how to come off it. So I like to consider my clinical philosophy kind of empowering in that way that I'm sharing that information. We share that in the sessions. Yeah. And then I don't like to be the expert. Obviously, I can't, because I'm not a medical doctor. I'm a psychologist. But this whole idea of an expert having to allow the patient to go this and that much down in dose and reduce, I'm completely against that whole idea. It's about sharing this knowledge, explaining it, and then together finding the best dose reductions. Okay. If that makes sense.
Oh, totally. I think like in the United States, we call that a collaborative relationship, essentially. Yeah.
And some people are not used to that. Many of the people I see are not used to that. They're not used to having, which is scary for me to see, to have a question asked about what they think they should do with the medication.
Yeah.
So it's a pretty empowering question actually to ask. And then I would also say, like, first, I'm sorry if I'm repeating myself, but as part of the tapering, I would definitely be sure to acknowledge the feeling of needing to calm one's mind, body, and then present the drug as one potential strategy to that. Emphasize the potential backside, and then inform people about these withdrawal symptoms, and also about maybe the need to, and that's why this is not just about tapering. It's not just about avoiding or minimizing withdrawal symptoms. It is as much, varies between people, obviously. If you've gotten used to having your mind numbed in some way, it can be an extremely difficult transition to not having it numb again. That transition from having been calmed or whatever effect it has to not having that. In my experience, nothing else looks like that. So we don't really have a manual for doing that, right? It's just to say that that's a part of it too, because we need other strategies. And that's what I was trying to talk about before. That's really where the clinical psychologist's toolkit comes into place, because we know how to teach people or how to show people how to manage their own mind without it being numb, but it could be a really difficult transition for sure.
Yeah, I can imagine too, after somebody has had sort of a taste of this pill form of something that can quiet the mind.
Yes.
And then to ask them to do it without, when they know that it exists or whatever, and how, I guess, sort of easy, if that's the right word, it would be just to take something, you know.
Exactly. It is kind of a little, and that's actually the most scary part with psychiatric drugs, is when they genuinely work, because you're right. Once you've gotten just most psychiatric drugs, I would say, cannot do that. Like, you would have to be a stronger, but some can. So having that door open just once, because it is a hack in some way. It's a trick.
Yeah. It's almost easier.
To calm your mind in that way, and it can be very, very effective and easy, just like alcohol can, for example. So just having been used to that strategy, and then, as you say, well, now, we're not taking it away, because I'm not trying to convince anyone to come off. They come to me when they want to. But abandoning that strategy, that's really difficult to do. But it would be the same no matter what strategy you've used. And that's always the same thing. Like, what works here and now over the short term usually creates problems long term, and the other way around. So we're trying to switch that. So, okay, you have to do something that may feel wrong right now. Actually, maybe you'll get more anxious. And then on the long term, you'll get less, but switching this balance between short and long term. But that's a clinical problem that we're used to in many other forms of psychotherapy. And that's really where it gets interesting to me. It's the exact same transition as you would do leaving any other emotion regulation strategy behind.
Yeah, I was just going to say, like, psychologically, maybe it's easier for the people who are having adverse effects from the medication, because they want to get rid of it, you know.
It sounds wrong to say, but it does have a function. It sounds so wrong, but because it's part of the motivation behind it. If you really have some really, really awful side effects, you're more motivated to come out. And you can definitely use that in some clinical way too. Not that I hope for people that they get side effects, of course.
Yeah. So you said just a minute ago, you did all this nerdy science stuff to learn like what was going on with the medications in the body. So I guess, like, if I was your psychotherapy client and you had to tell me, in 1 or 2 sentences, sort of how the drugs are working or affecting somebody based on what you've learned, like, how would you describe it?
It's luckily it's simpler than you'd think, because once you've had these drugs categorized as drugs, like, as they're synthetic. That's the key word, and that's not controversial. We made them ourselves in laboratory. It's synthesized from different components. That's the definition of something being synthetic. And the body knows, it can recognize when we put synthetic things into it for a long period of time. The reason that's important is that the body gets used to it. So it kind of just does the opposite long term. So and this relates to, not that that's the topic for today, but when we understand that there are no imbalances, you may have more or less serotonin or dopamine or whatever, but it's not considered an imbalance by the brain itself.
Mhm.
So when you treat it as if it was an imbalance, when in fact it's not, the body will adapt. So that's really the key thing to understand. The body adapts. We can't just enter the brain and increase certain neurotransmitters and then hope that will go, because the body will do the opposite, and that's where withdrawal comes in. If you do this for prolonged periods of time, the body will adapt, and it'll need time to readapt.
Mm-hmm.
And that takes time. The body is fundamentally hardwired to do that. And that's when tapering comes in. We can't just stop from one day to another. It'll create too large a task for the body, for the brain. It takes time, and we need to give it in small bits and pieces. That's the idea of reducing the dose.
Okay, so now we're into tapering, and I'm wondering, where did you learn about the tapering protocols that you use with your clients?
That's such a good. I've been thinking about that question because I don't really use a protocol per se. I would say I learned it in practice from, well, there are two answers. And the first one is this: I learned it from practice, from teaching my clients to listen to their bodies and kind of look for that bodily feedback after each dose reduction. And then we listen to that together and patterns start to emerge. So that's why in all my writing, you'll never see this many percentages after that many days kind of rule. You'll never see that because it's way too complicated to even make these rules, because they'll change as you proceed down. So most people, if you're in a high dose, you can make some pretty large drops in the beginning, and then it has to go down to sometimes 5 to 10 or even less percent, actually often less than 5%.
Yeah.
So the overall idea, or the protocol, if I had to have one, is like it's really simple. We reduce, stabilize, whatever that means, and reduce and stabilize and reduce and stabilize, and continue doing that, constantly using that bodily feedback. Your body will tell you whether it was too large a reduction or not. And we can start to find patterns in that as far as that's possible. Usually the symptoms would emerge will arise on the same number of days after reduction. It's not set in stone rules. That's the problem. But so the protocol would be that. And obviously the receptor occupancy curves, which is just a fancy word for, we can measure the degree to which the drug does in the brain what it's supposed to. So we can get an idea of when to taper slower. Obviously, those occupancy curves, they do give us some guidance. So based on this, some basic pharmacological understanding of what withdrawal is. So I've gotten some pretty good ideas over the years of what the next reduction can be. But it's one of the problems. It's very difficult to predict. And that means that most people will at some point make a reduction that is too big. And then it's rarely avoided. And then obviously you're left with two choices, either to hold it out and then reduce slower after that, or increase back up. I hope that would work.
Yeah.
But these percentage rules, I'm not a big fan of them, because I see some people getting too obsessed about them when it's actually not really. We don't have those.
Yeah, it's very arbitrary. Yeah, a lot of people want like a guide, or they want something, instructions, just do this, and tapering it doesn't work that way. It's very flexible.
No.
Yeah.
And that's the very, very annoying answer from the psychologist here, or from anyone who knows this. Like, we can't apply this rule setting mode of mind. It does not apply here, and we have to understand that, and it can actually end up being counterproductive if we think we can plan.
Right.
Obviously, it's not completely without rules. As I said, we can get some ideas, especially if you're on a very high dose. Some can actually, because there's kind of a what's that word? Saturation point, I would say, that at some point we can't keep adding drugs to the body, and then it'll have an effect. So if we have on a very high dose, some people can actually reduce quite dramatically without any withdrawal symptoms. And then at some point, you reach that threshold where the reductions have to be 5-10%. And it varies where that is. But it's just to say that if you follow a 5 or 10% rule from the beginning, will risk ending up, and this may sound weird coming from me, but actually doing it slower than we could, because we're tapering very slowly in a dose range where nothing really happens between those doses. And that's why these reduction rules are very difficult. And you can see that I've noted every single dose reduction I've ever made on my passive mate while working with this. I've noted them down just with date and size of the reduction. And there's very few times there's a system in that, because it's subjective.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So I was listening to some webinar that you were a part of, and I'm sorry, I don't remember which one it was, but
what did I say there?
Well, you were talking about a lot of people think that they need a doctor or something to come off psychiatric medications.
Yeah.
We hear that all the time, like, make sure, do it under the supervision of your doctor. But then you said, that you don't really think that GPs and psychiatrists know anything more about tapering than what can be found in the withdrawal community that exists online. And that, in the same sentence as the people telling you have to have a doctor, they also tell you don't trust the internet. But you said that we know that the information in the online withdrawal support communities are correct, and it's been verified by some studies. So can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sounds like something I could have said.
Yeah.
Well, I generally do believe that to be true. And actually I'm doing research myself, but I'm very, very careful always to not put it out there as something that I figured out when we do that. I like the other way around, because the withdrawal community has existed, I don't know for how many decades, as long as people have been on these drugs, and they've
I think as long as there's
in community.
In the internet, I think people have been in withdrawal finding each other. Yeah.
Yes, always been. Just search for any drug name on Facebook or online, and one of the first things you'll find, at least on Facebook, is some community where people help each other to come off that drug. The point is, much of this knowledge that we have today comes from that, and not from researchers figuring out first. And it's so wrong it's just not okay to kind of, not that that's the important part, but to take credit for that and say, we figured out that hyperbolic tapering is the good idea, which is the technical term for what I just described before, this idea of tapering extremely slowly in the end, and the idea that the next reduction consistently has to be smaller than the previous one.
Yeah,
I can see like post on that online that goes decades back. So what am I trying to say here? I'm trying to say the knowledge comes from there, and then afterwards some studies have kind of confirmed that. I don't like that word either, but I can see it. And there's still the withdrawal community and people, these tiny dose reductions you have to go by. It's kind of been laughed off a bit by researchers, like it can't be true, like just start at the smallest dose.
Yeah.
And now there's actually evidence to suggest that it does make sense, because these drugs, the solution is very simple. The answer is very simple. They're extremely potent, even at smaller doses that you can buy at the pharmacy. So I think what I was trying to say there is that obviously it's a good and well-informed doctor on board is always a good thing. Of course, and actually many, at least in Denmark, are beginning to take this problem seriously. But problem is most doctors are not. Because they've been misinformed, and that's not for them to blame. It's the system behind them creating the guidelines and the academic journals. So if your doctor chooses to act on that information and their clinical practice guidelines and not to what you say, I would say they're counterproductive. I don't see what they add. In fact, they might also, when if the information on how severe withdrawal can be and what the symptoms actually are is understated in some way, which it is in the guidelines, what happens usually is that you end up misinterpreting withdrawal as relapse, like the classic problem. That puts you in one of two positions. Either it causes doubt in you, whether this is withdrawal, and then you can get all the racing thoughts about that. That's not promoting a lot of healing. Or you end up in a position where you have to defend yourself and argue. And neither of these two situations really promote the healing you need of the recovery. So
Yeah.
I think when I said that, it's because I've been observing this too many times. It's too stressful.
Yeah.
Put that on top.
Yeah. Makes total sense.
That's why we're trying to change the guidelines. That's really two of my papers actually they are on the guidelines. We systematically looked through these guidelines and saw these absurd descriptions of withdrawal symptoms as something self-limiting and lasting a couple of weeks, maybe a couple of months in some people, and the way they. So this is really our gatekeeper here, that is to change the guidelines, make them updated.
Yeah. So while you're talking about that, I wonder, like, what is the state of things in Denmark currently around psychiatric drug withdrawal and slow tapering? Are they way behind? Are they catching up? Like, how's it going over there?
That's a good question. It's not very good. It's definitely not caught up. It's not very good, but things are happening.
Okay.
I believe because we make it happen. We're only 6 million people in Denmark, so it's pretty easy to get time in the media and reach the politicians, and so, which I've done. And we're really creating a lot of awareness with a lot of events. I think I have, like, on average, 1 weekly, or maybe 2 actually, lectures, talks, workshops on this. But I do that as a reaction. So the current state is as bad, I would say, as it is in your place. Many people are still told they can just stop the drug. The guidelines are as bad as ever. All of the problems I just mentioned. But things are. I like to believe that things are happening. We could definitely, just compared to just 1 or 2 years ago, we can now write things both in the academic journals and in the public media that we couldn't before.
Right.
In terms of the problem.
Okay. Yeah.
So
back to your psychotherapy clients, you have them in a taper and they're making these reductions, and you guys have this collaborative relationship. What kind of support have you noticed that people who are withdrawing need from you as a psychologist? Or from, people around them too, family, or, that kind of stuff.
It really depends on what the symptoms are, but one of the most tricky type of symptoms are the symptoms that look so much like maybe what you got the drug for, or some other psychological disorder, in lack of better word. I wouldn't call it a disorder, but like, it can look like depression. It can look like anxiety. It can feel exactly as if something is wrong, like really wrong, like you're threatened. That's why it causes so much anxiety. So it can feel exactly like something's wrong, terribly wrong, when there in fact is nothing wrong. But you'll be left with the feeling.
Yeah.
And
it's very real and convincing. Yeah.
Yes. So, and exactly. And you need to be, well, what most people say, need to be reminded that it's not that it's not real, because you say it feels real, but it isn't real. I hope that makes sense to people out there, because it isn't. It's like a chemically induced thing, but it feels exactly as something's terribly wrong. And that's a very, very tricky situation to be in, because one would think that the solution was to constantly argue with those thoughts and feelings. And if you do that, that adds another like a complete psychological layer of distress on top of that, if you have to feel like that and this mental debate going on back and forth.
Right.
That's stressful too. So the situation is, how do we survive that? How do we get through so many dose reductions, where after each reduction it may feel like something's wrong, terribly wrong, anxious without it being it. And usually it's a very specific way of talking about it, but mostly if we've made a small enough reduction, this whole mess, this whole noise will be under some type of attentional control. And what does that mean? Like, usually if it's possible to do something and stay engaged, and that's the whole problem, you might lack complete motivation and like energy to do it. That's the problem, right? But most people will say when they're engaged, when they do stuff with people, do something they like, it kind of tends to step in the background. Not that it goes away, but it kind of tends to step in the background. And that's the mechanism we're going for. So one thing is, which is the obvious first goal, is to completely avoid withdrawal, like taper so slowly that there are no or very few withdrawal symptoms. And that can happen for some people, but not for all. Next question is, how do we help people get through it then? And this attentional thing, it may sound basic. Now, obviously, of course, I don't feel it while I'm doing stuff. Well, that's really, really important, because that means it must be under some degree of control, and that's what we're going for.
So you
So
mean like distraction, or being involved in something where you can kind of just leave it in the background a little bit. It's not gone, but you can be engaging your mind in a way where you're not noticing it front and center all the time.
So that's the what we're going for. Like, the symptoms can be there without getting in focus. That's the shift we're trying to make. And I don't really, you call it distraction, that's like, but I wouldn't use that term. It sounds negative to me. I would always call it controllability in some way. We'd have some talks about. And then we have some very annoying psychology questions for this, like, it must be under some control. If it is so that when you're engaged in stuff, it feels like it's not there. And that's what we're going for. And we can learn to use that mechanism. Because what will happen for some people is that they could we usually just kind of, in crisis situations, we're doing the opposite of what we should be doing, right? Not that I'm going to say that, but like kind of isolate and stay away from things that can actually help us to disengage from that. So there are definitely some techniques you can do around that. And then this very specific thing of being in that situation and not arguing with those thoughts, not worrying, not ruminating about those thoughts, because that adds stress on top of it.
Yeah. Okay. So then, we're talking about the person in withdrawal and how they, manage symptoms and what kind of support they need. But I'm wondering about you. Have you been in situations with clients who are in intense withdrawal and they are very difficult to deal with, or they're, they require a lot from you emotionally? And if so, like, what has the impact been on you as a psychotherapist?
That's a kind question.
Yeah.
If you have to think about that, that's a good question.
I think, Anders, because we know that we're like, I would be the first to admit in withdrawal that I'm a lot. Like, I can be draining and difficult on my family members who are supporting me and stuff. So I just wonder if it feels that way as, somebody supporting people through this all day long as your career.
It usually, luckily or not luckily, it ends well for almost everyone. So the end, it ends good. That kind of, it's not a struggle all the way. And there are also a lot of good things. I would say that it's not, we're so quick to focus on all the bad things from coming off, which is obviously the problem. We shouldn't just sit around talking about the good things, but there are as many good things from this, obviously. So just to point that out. But yes, it is a struggle too. And I think the worst part of it is that it's, to me, that's why I told that long story in the beginning, like it was this sense of that it's just unfair. Yeah. Mostly because people are not informed. If you're completely informed that it could look like this when you're tapering, it will be less of a problem to me, because people will have known. So it's this element I knew and I've known that I wanted to be a psychologist for it. Like, there was not a second place thing I wanted to. This was it. And so I knew I was going to work with a lot of people in distress and despair and pain and suffering. I knew that going into it, but I didn't know so much of it would be doctor made, like medically induced. That part of it, really, really, really provokes me, and still does to this day. And I think that's why I can power through with most of this, because that's and I'm pretty open about that also in therapy, and that's why I think I connect so well actually in the first session with people, because they will have the same. Almost everyone. I'm sure you'd have it too. Yeah. This sense, I don't know what the English word is. What would you call it? It's unfair.
Oh, like an injustice, maybe?
Yes, exactly. That feeling.
Yeah. And
getting angry about that too, on top of being in withdrawal.
Yeah.
That to me is the worst to answer that question.
Yeah. And a lot of people are very angry, especially in the beginning. Yeah, it
Of
feels like
course.
a violation, or I've heard it even described like it feels like people were raped or something was,
Yes,
done to them against their consent,
exactly.
essentially. Yeah.
And it can be pretty big. And remember, this is on top of withdrawal, because by definition, you're on drugs and trying to come off. So these
Yeah.
elements on top of being in withdrawal can really be tricky. And so most of it, especially if it's with the, let's say, antipsychotics or strong antidepressants for maybe 2 decades, for example.
Yeah.
So what can happen? These are the most scariest days at my office, believe me, is when they first realize after reducing or coming off the drug, how much of an impact the drugs had on their life.
Yeah.
But maybe especially on the antipsychotics, because they're so strong that you can actually not really, sometimes you can't see it while it's there. And then you wake up first to your own mind and then to seeing your friends and peers having built lives and you haven't because you've been stuck in withdrawal. That's a big one. That's tough.
Yeah. But you talked about the goodness. I mean, it must be amazing to watch people sort of reclaim their power and their sanity and their wellness
Yes.
and their emotions. And
Yes.
yeah.
It's really, and we remember like it's also all the good stuff that comes back. And that's really, once we learn how to navigate that, those with, first of all, withdrawal and the just natural pain of this human mind we've all got when it really takes over, it's a good thing. People, that's why I emphasized that before, people end up happy most of the time, and that's just worth it all.
Yeah.
But the struggle, and even because some of it seems so unnecessary, like this could have been avoided, especially once we consider how ineffective most of these drugs really are. Like it would change the picture a bit if they were extremely effective, but some of them are not. So I see a lot of people who do not feel helped at all from that drug and still struggle coming off. That makes it worse, right?
Yeah. So then it was like a complete waste. I'm sure it feels like.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So you were co-author on a paper called Estimating the Risk of Antidepressant Withdrawal.
Yes.
From a review of published data. And I thought that was such a fascinating paper that you guys came out with, where you can actually sort of look at data and see who might be at most risk for having withdrawal syndromes from, certain antidepressants and that kind of thing. We'll put that paper in the comments for anybody who's interested in reading it. But I'm wondering, aside from that research, what other research are you working on in this space? And also, what research are we lacking? What do we need?
So what research? Actually, at the moment, I'm not working on any research. A couple of papers maybe, but that doesn't. I'm not prioritizing that right now because I don't believe we need more research right now. That's not the main problem. We don't need to figure out more things. We need to act on the research that's already there, I would say. There's plenty of research that if you brought clinical practice in accordance with that, like updated that, there'd be enough to do for the next many decades. So we don't need more research. We need to act on the research that's there. Some of it, how slowly you have to taper and what the true withdrawal symptoms are and how ineffective antidepressants in particular actually are. So my main project now is writing a book. I'm with a publisher here in Denmark. I'll have it translated to English too. But I'm actually working on a book as a way of disseminating this and telling this story, that because we're so quick to say, at least here in Denmark, like that we need more research, more money, more funds, as if that would solve the problems. I don't believe that to be the case. So to object against that, I chose to write a book instead about it.
Okay.
About coming off psychiatric drugs. Yes.
Nice. When do you that's maybe an annoying question, but everybody, whenever you're creating something, they want to know, when's it going to be ready?
Yeah. My deadline is on June 4th.
Okay.
I made that deadline myself. I don't know why, because it's pretty soon from here, but it'll be done. Obviously that's in Danish, and then I'll have it translated. So I don't know how long that'll take. Later, sometime this year. Okay. It's my main project because we have, so that's the problem we have. And I follow all these Facebook groups, and I see many of the same questions. That's obviously not blaming the person, obviously not, but I see a lot of questions being asked where I know that we know the answer. It's there. It's not that we need that knowledge. So, and we have a lot of, there are a lot of do's and don'ts still on tapering that can help people come off. And actually what Bak my Rifle was, I have a little, it's in Danish, I can have that translated. I have a little like 10, 12 page basic guideline I've written in Danish on psychiatric drug withdrawal. Many of the things we talked about here today are in that. I just wrote that and sent it out online. Point is that I get a lot of feedback from that people actually were able to come off just by that information. That's incredible how much information can do.
Wow.
So that was kind of my idea to upgrade that to a full book. Not that it can help anyone to come off, but for many people, it's mostly a knowledge problem. Like they don't have the proper knowledge because they're not informed, which is one of the huge problems, right? It's not that we don't have the knowledge; it's just not spread.
Right. That pamphlet or whatever that you wrote, the short guide, is it only in your language or has it been translated?
It's only in Danish, but I could have it translated if I prioritized it.
Yeah. Okay. Just curious if people, wanted to find it, but
yeah, it's really, I guess it would be pretty straightforward to translate, but it's really considering how many people are on these drugs and how many are struggling with coming off. If we could just help so many by just releasing the knowledge, which is there. Yeah, that's a low-hanging fruit in some way, and that doesn't involve generating more knowledge. So if we had to make, because I did consider that, because now you are going to ask that question, if we should do more, or when we should do more research, we should go back to what they did in the actually 50s, 60s, like what's called qualitative research, like where they ask a lot of patients on different drugs, what are the experienced effect of this drug, and how is it helpful or harmful? And like this goes back to this idea of the drug-centered model, Moncrief's work too, but framing this as strategies. So this was actually the way the drugs were studied back in the 50s and 60s. You were interested in the actual subjective experience of taking the drug and then discussing how can this be helpful. And this was completely forgotten many decades ago because then it became all a question of receptors and biochemistry and what happens in the brain. So it got completely, I would actually say completely lost. And it sounds absurd because it's a very subjective thing to take a drug. And you're the only one to tell if it helps you or not, how it makes you feel. So when we're going to do more research, I'll definitely go back to that, like get a lot of data from people who actually experience both on the drug and coming off. We definitely need that. And we need to put that center of whoever expert will say about something or what happens in the brain. That's definitely secondary to how you feel about it.
Yeah. What about research though about, there's all these different methods of tapering. For example, you can do a percentage that is, maybe within what you're talking about, the receptor occupancy that seems like it would be a good drop. And you can hold and you can wait for the symptoms to stabilize after you've reduced. Or people have done these micro-taper type reductions where they're doing tiny microgram reductions every single day that are sort of adding up to a percentage over time. So what about like research that compares tapering methods and severity of symptoms, or does that sound?
That would really be good. There's a long way of that. First of all, it's extremely expensive to do, meaning, and that's not an obstacle in itself, but it'll take time to make that. And you'd first have to convince, really, at some point in academia, we are still at Adam and Eve to still explain that it is a bigger problem as it is to come off. So from there to start comparing different tapering methods in the way I just described, I just believe there's too huge a gap. I don't see it coming. I know there are some studies on that coming, so it's not entirely true, but other questions would need to be asked first before academia would seriously consider these questions. And it will come eventually, of course it will. I just don't see that's where we are right now. And also I'll see, my problem with those kind of methods would be the same as just before. It's personal. It's subjective. And the only rule, if we can have any, is when you feel ready to taper again. It's really difficult to set that up in a system.
Yeah.
So I don't really see.
So
it
don't hold
happening.
my breath is what you're saying on that one. Yeah.
Not for that.
Okay.
Because it would be difficult to, even with the result from those kind of studies, would be difficult to implement in each person entering.
Oh yeah.
room
And then
and
all
not
the
to come
different
out.
drugs too. I mean, there's so many, you know.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly.
So just like I asked you in the beginning, you know, how you came to this work, I kind of asked people a similar question towards the end of the interview, which is, how have colleagues and psychiatrists and you know, fellow people in the PhD world that you've encountered, how do they receive your work in this space?
That's everything from support and praise, even to angry people saying that I cross boundaries when entering the medical field. And I would say it's the opposite that's happening. Well, I think they crossed into my field or our field with the drugging of the human mind and symptomatic treatment of general problems, and calling people who really struggle and have been through trauma, for example, calling them sick is one of the most provocative things I could imagine. So I would really say that that's my usual answer to that. And I do get that a lot, because obviously it is a weird thing as a psychologist to enter this field. I've studied it well enough before I did it, of course, but I like to turn it around, really say that I think they crossed into our field with their drugs and their diagnosis. And so it's really, but that was the negative part of it, because most people, at least in my area of psychologists, they generally have seen the problem themselves in some way or another, just haven't been able to articulate it. So they're generally supporting, and I'm collaborating a lot with the Danish Psychological Association, it would be called. I'm teaching Withdrawal as a part of the continuing education for psychologists. So you can actually choose a 2-day course on tapering and what we're talking about here as part of your education to become specialized as a psychologist. So that happened just last year. So in that sense, it must be approved in some way.
Yeah, to be able to offer it.
So it's a bit of both, really. It's a funny thing, but some just support it a lot and really say thank you and praise it a lot, and some get extremely angry. Like the emotional span is just huge.
Wow.
On this. Yeah.
Okay. So we have a few minutes left and we have some questions from the audience. Somebody wants to know, how is it possible to have short-term benefit from a drug when it takes so long to come off and create long-term harm? They said they're having a hard time understanding how antipsychotics could ever be justified.
Oh yes, well I would definitely say the same thing. I just don't. It's just not up for how you answer that. Some people do get an effect that they can use for something acutely. That's not up for me or anyone else to judge. But some people say they feel helped by it and have maybe not as many problems coming off. So in that way, some people will experience it as a good thing.
Right.
It's not for me to ever say. So I wouldn't put myself or any other person than the person itself.
Yeah.
To conclude that, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Because I absolutely agree. And the cases where they actually genuinely work and are helpful are very, very few. A lot of people go around believing the drugs work because they feel so awful from trying to stop them. But that's a different issue, right? That's the whole thing we're trying to find out here. Yeah. But it's just the way, and I remember, because I said that in the beginning, it's just, and that's actually even acknowledged by some pretty major institutions. This whole idea, we can't just talk about, do drugs work, yes or no? It has to be divided in some way that a lot of people, even from some of the fine institutions, would agree, yes, they can help some people in the short term. In the long term, they generally do more harm than good. That was the point I was trying to make.
Yeah, makes total sense. I mean, I notice when people are harmed, and it happened to me too, and I completely understand it, like your immediate feeling is like, oh my gosh, these drugs are capable of so much devastation
Yeah.
that they should be banned or we should get rid of
Yes.
them. And that's such a snap judgment where sometimes
Exactly.
we have to calm down a little bit and pull back and understand, well, there are some, like, I don't want to have a colonoscopy, for example, without being sedated, you know?
No.
So there are things, there are uses for the medication.
Mhm.
It's just that, right, we have misused them in so many cases.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's the way they're used that really is, and the story that's told with them that's just
Yeah.
outright wrong. And that's really, it is a point itself worth to emphasize. They have just as alcohol and coffee and all other things we can take have very, very diverse effects.
Yeah.
We must remember that. For some, it helps a bit. For some, it does absolutely nothing. It's actually possible to take an antidepressant, for example, and not feel a thing. You still
Right.
have difficulties coming off it. But antipsychotics, I don't believe you can take without having some effect, good or bad, of it. But it's just this idea that it's impossible to know in advance. Like you can get manic and euphoric and annoyed or anxious or calmed or sedated by the same drug. There's no way of telling in the
Right.
beginning. That's part of the problem too.
Yeah.
Mm.
Okay. So this person says, what does Anders think of the expression remission?
The expression remission.
Yes. If you've only got
Uh,
antidepressants to numb your emotions, besides that, depression is not a brain disease. Can you be in remission if you didn't have a brain disease?
it really depends what you mean with remission.
Mm-hmm.
Usually that would be a medical word for either that your disease, as it would be called there, is not there anymore, or that it's still there, but it's managed under control in some way. And so I would never use that word in any case. So what's the question, what that means?
It just says, what does Anders think of the expression remission? I'm not even
Okay,
sure.
so I don't like it because it communicates either that there is this underlying disease,
Mm-hmm.
and we have a lot of that, like people who haven't been psychotic maybe for 10 years and they still have the diagnosis because it's just considered it's still there. You haven't had symptoms for a decade, but it's still there. Like this idea of not acknowledging that maybe it was the wrong diagnosis. And I see the word, at least in Danish, and don't know if it's used in the same way in English. That would be the use of that word.
Okay.
And I strongly disagree with that. Yeah.
Okay. Got it. And then here's a question somebody asked, which I'm glad they did because it happened to me and I've met people that it's happened to. So I'm wondering, in all of your studies and even working with people in withdrawal, have you ever encountered people who either they came off too quickly or after their taper was done, sort of like this period of months, and then all of a sudden they get what's called, in the layperson community, we call it a delayed withdrawal, where you get this huge rush of symptoms that people weren't expecting, I guess, because we think of healing like linearly, you know?
Yes, so, it's not.
Yeah. Why
No.
did I get symptoms? You know, I think mine was like 4 months after my cold turkey is when the most severe symptoms happened. And you may not have an answer because so much of this we don't have answers for, but I'm wondering if you've encountered it. Or
I haven't seen any good like explanations for why that occurs, but it definitely is a thing. Like as you would say with linear, that's another part of it. Like just withdrawal symptoms from each reduction they don't necessarily heal linearly. They can come in waves and windows. That's the whole idea. So it's the same principle here. Like, why can the symptoms occur? Who knows what happens in the body after those 4 months? One thing is, so I'd say it definitely does exist, and a huge part of the problem is that that's even less acknowledged than more quote normal withdrawal symptoms that occur some days after the reduction is done. This is even more difficult for people to grasp, but I've seen it happen so many times that I don't have a single shred of doubt that it's possible. The only explanation I could find is that and we know that that's just like with carbohydrates, for example, and energy in any way that they tend to store in the body. So one explanation could be that once you're off the drug, once you stop taking, or you take the last pill, your body will obviously use that, and at some point it will start, I don't know what the English word for that is, like take from the drug that's been stored in your body fat, for example, muscles and body, and that could give a spike up to many months after.
Right.
So some of it could be with that drug. This is purely theoretical. If that drug is released only after a certain period of time, so you've stopped introducing the drug to the body, but at some point it will use its own reserves, or what to call it, and that could give a spike. It's one of these things we just don't know, but we definitely know that it's true, so it should be acknowledged.
Yeah. The distressing part about it is when you go to the doctor, right? And you're like, I'm 4 months out and I'm actually more severe than I was to begin with. And they say, that's not possible. The drug is out of your system. No way.
And withdrawal is, it's the lamest argument that because the drug's out of your system, it can't be withdrawal, because that's what withdrawal is. It's the body reacting
to the drug being out of your system.
To the drug being out of the system. So it's such a bad excuse. It's really, people haven't understood the first thing about withdrawal, if that's their argument, because that's the whole problem. I would say most of the times where I've seen this delayed withdrawal was from a taper that occurred too fast. Like from a not slow enough taper caused that. I don't have the evidence to say that it only happens, but usually when I see it, it doesn't happen when we taper correctly, which could involve getting down to 1/10th, 3 or 1/15th of the smallest dose, which sounds absurd, but you know that to be the case. Yeah.
All right. So we're at the hour, and I just want to give you a chance for any closing thoughts or resources. We're going to put your website and all your social media links in the comments and description box for people to follow you and, look out for your book when it's ready. But is there anything you want to say before we go?
I'll try to have that little guide translated. I can maybe get that done. Otherwise, the next
sorry, I gave you more work.
No, that's good. That's fine. We can help if we can help people. We haven't because most of my things are in Danish. That's the problem here. But we actually have an event in Oslo physically on April 5th. Laura Delano, which some of you might know, the director of the Inner Compass Initiative, and then a Norwegian comedian called Dex Carrington and I are having an event in Oslo, which is going to be streamed. So that's the next big thing, April 5th. And the link is in my Facebook, just my name and then -PhD, you'll find it there. That's the next upcoming event, which is in English that you could maybe consider.
We'll try to find the link, and we'll include that for people when we post this on YouTube. We'll put it there for folks.
And then I'll better get that book done and get it translated, because it's needed. As we started about talking, one of these is an information problem. We have a lot of the knowledge. We don't need to generate more. We need to spread it in some way, and that's a different problem, right? Which is pretty straightforward to solve. We're trying.
I agree. It's sort of teaching doctors, right, so that this problem stops happening on this side, and then for people who are already in the problem, an exit plan with education and how to do it properly.
Exactly.
All right, Anders. Well, it's been a pleasure talking to you, and thank you so much for all the work that you're doing. And I'm excited to get your book when it's ready. And thanks everybody who tuned in today for this live discussion. If you have not seen the film Medicating Normal yet and you want to, you can go to our website at medicatingnormal.com/watch. And if you want to support the film's outreach efforts with a donation, you can do so at medicatingnormal.com/donate. Thanks again, Anders, and everybody for watching, and we'll be in touch and talk soon.
I hope it was helpful for people out there in one way or another.
Oh, I'm sure it was hugely helpful. It was a great conversation.
Thank you.